All right. I am Paul Acey.
I'm Kennedy Unthank.
We work for Plugged In, and tomorrow we have a new podcast dropping that's going to be talking a lot about Dungeons and Dragons. You may have heard of this game. Kennedy definitely has heard of this game. You are sort of, I don't know whether we technically have a Dungeons and Dragons expert, but if we did, it would definitely be you. So
I guess so, sure.
So I gotta ask, when did you first start playing?
Actually, it was about a year ago, honestly.
Really?
Oh, a little more than a year ago.
Oh, so you didn't grow up with it then?
No. I had never even really heard of it until a few years ago. But, you know, we had some friends at church back when I was in Florida, and we just decided, hey, we're all kind of interested in games. Why don't we get together and play this? And we did, and we had a good time.
Yeah.
And so it made me excited to build my own little world that I could share with some other people when I came out here.
Yeah.
And then we played through that, and that was a lot of fun. And so, you know, I've always been a big fan of Tolkien.
Yeah.
And so, essentially getting to build my own little Tolkien-verse is really fun. I've always enjoyed that.
Well, and you always do things, you know, all the way. From what I understand, we have not played D&D, but you are the dungeon master for, and you did like a 220-page campaign, is that right?
Yeah, you know, and to clarify that, I didn't have a job at the time. So while I was searching for jobs, I was also, I was building this thing. And, you know, it was one of those things where you get to the end and you're like, oh, but what if, you know? And so it was one of those things where I just thought, well, it'd be kind of cool if I was a part of it. So then I started adding more and more and more, and eventually I was like, okay, I can't do anymore. It's been 200 pages. And, but, you know, because of my thoroughness, it made for a fun experience.
That's very cool. That's very cool. So in this movie, I'm not as familiar with Dungeons and Dragons as you are. I think back when I was growing up, it was a little bit more scandalous than it is today, you know, and so parents were a little bit leery of it. But I did learn enough about it to recognize, just even watching the trailer. I haven't seen the movies, but I recognize some of the creatures in the trailer. Yeah. So is there a really highlight level creature in the movie that drew your attention?
I think there's one called a Displacer Beast, which you briefly see in the trailer. It basically looks like a Black Panther.
Oh, okay.
But it's got these tentacles on it. And what the tentacles are, it's going to be really nerdy, I'm sorry. But what the tentacles are doing is it kind of makes these illusory copies of itself, like a hologram. Yeah. And it uses those in order to trick its prey, so it can sneak up from behind when they're looking at the fake one in front of them. And I think they do a really good job with that. It looks very cool, you know, when you're thinking of like, oh, wow, like look, I mean, that's why I got so invested in like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis Narnia.
Well, all the creatures
are so cool. When you see the Ents and you see Mr. Tumnus and you see
Yeah.
all this stuff and you're like, that's so cool. I think that's probably a highlight for me.
Yeah. And I do think that's one of the appeals to it, right? I mean, you do find yourself in this new world, and you as a dungeon master can make that world however you want in a way. But you know, it's the creatures. It's one of the things that I really like to do and talk about nerdy. When I was, 16, I would just look at the monster manual. You know, if you are familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, they have these huge books that sort of detail all the different things, and I would just look at the monster manual because they had so many cool creatures.
Yeah. And you were pointing out something, or alluding to it, was it's really based on your imagination. Yeah. Which is really the draw to the game in general for a lot of people, including myself. Yeah. I've always, as a writer, I've always loved writing just these fantasy worlds, even when I was a kid, I was always drawn into fantasy. And Tolkien has a great essay on this, which I referenced briefly in the podcast. It's called On Fairy Stories, which is essentially the first one of the first, at least well-known critical essays about the value of fantasy stories. And in it, he kind of talks about how it offers this sense of escapism, not to a negative, which it can become a negative,
Right, sure,
so I want to point that out. But it offers this sense of escapism into a world where, oh, these things are cool, but they make you kind of appreciate the world around you at the same time. Which he leads that into kind of the story of a eucatastrophe with an EU at the start, meaning good. And he says, the best fantasy stories have these moments where you are just in the deepest depths of despair, everything's broken, but then in that moment, that's when everything turns for good. It turns to the light and everything is solved all at once. You know, like think about Luke Skywalker blowing up the Death Star at the last moment, or Frodo throwing the ring into Mount Doom at the last moment, which is Tolkien's story.
Right.
And you see these moments, and he says, well, those point ultimately to the ultimate eucatastrophe, which is Christ's resurrection. And so when we see that stuff, we just get we just are reminded that the most important eucatastrophe is not in a fantasy story, but it's in real life. And we get to appreciate that more through exploring these.
I think that's absolutely right. You know, and when you think about, you know, some of my favorite writers who were Christians, you know, you talk about C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, one of my very favorite G.K. Chesterton. He had such a strong appreciation for these fairy tales because it allowed you to sink into these worlds that showed truth just a little bit askew, right? It gives you a chance to talk about good and evil. It talks about the chance to push to your limits. Even though, I mean, we're talking about a game where you roll dice, so it's not like you're being physically challenged, but you still have those elements within those worlds, right? So.
No, and that's there's a G.K. Chesterton pretty famous quote where he says that, you know, fantasy stories don't teach children about dragons because children already know that dragons exist. You know, they already create these things in their mind. They already know about the boogeyman. But what fantasy stories do is they teach children that their dragons can be slain. And something I've always appreciated with the genre is that element. Is, you know, every time we go and we see an animated children's movie, you know, every time I get assigned an animated children's movie, I'm a little excited because I'm like, typically the plot's not going to be as muddled. It's going to be a more basic story of good versus evil. And I think that's why they tend to stick with us a bit more. It's like when we watch stuff like Up or The Incredibles or, you know, movies like that, which have this, I mean, they're pretty simple in terms of their like moral quandaries, you know. But they kind of stick with us because they get to the more root of the issue, which I think fantasy stories have a better ability to do than a lot of other genres do.
Well, again, I think it's because they're in this different world, and because you're able to deal with some of these things more directly. It gives the story a little more pop. You know, and I know that there's lots of people who just don't gravitate toward fantasy, science fiction. They'd much have a more real world environment for their stories. But for me, growing up, you know, those were the stories that really resonated. And you know, when we talk about this, is probably a little too serious for you know, live stream. But when we talk about the idea of creating this world, you know, that's one of the things that in our job I sort of come back to again and again and again. We as humans cannot create things as God does. We cannot, you know, conjure a shrub right out of thin air. We cannot do these things. But when I think about how we are made in God's image, one of the things that draws me into that is the idea that we have the instinct and the desire to create. You know, and so we sort of, when we create these worlds, it's sort of like, it's almost an homage to our own creator who made our world, because it allows us to, it's just a desire that we have to create things as much as we can in our very human scope can, right?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think it's just one of those things where, excuse me, we have just, like you said, this desire within us. It's like, oh, I want to enjoy the things that God has given me, and in that, I want to try and be able to, mimic that in a way. Now, of course, that brings us obviously into the more bad side of stuff, where people start to get into, when you start talking about magic and stuff, there's obviously some stuff there where it's like, I never want to be like, oh, well, this is full sale, go do
right,
this.
Right, absolutely.
But one of the things that I essentially lean on Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians 9, which are Paul talking about food that is offered to idols, and whether or not it's okay to eat this meat that's been offered to idols. And essentially it says, hey, if this is going to bind your conscience, if this is going against your conscience, if you think that doing this is a sin, then don't do it, because for you it is going to be a sin.
Right.
Because if you still engage in that, even though you thought it was a sin, then what you're saying is, hey, even though I thought it was a sin, I still did it. Which God says, well, that is sinning. But we know these things aren't real. When we know they have no power over us. We know that that we're using as an element of just a time to bond with one another. And I'm talking about Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, absolutely, because you get together with friends.
Yeah, and I mean, we've even used it as an evangelistic tool. Is we had a friend in our group who wasn't a Christian, and so we got to spend that time and pour into that guy who, all his life had kind of, when we invited him to the group and we said, we've got some church friends who are going to play a game of D&D, he was like, I never thought I'd hear that sentence. And he joined us, and we got to have that great connection with him, and we got to share the gospel, and it was a great time. But yeah, so I think that's my only caution with the game is if you are the kind of person who thinks that you will be drawn away by it, then I would say don't do it. In the same way that if you think playing Monopoly is going to make you a greedy venture capitalist, and you think that you're going to be drawn into stealing people's money, I was like, don't play Monopoly.
I'll be honest, when I play Monopoly, I do get a little evil. So,
yeah, but and that's the thing, it's like with Monopoly though, no one bats an eye.
No,
because everyone knows you're playing pretend.
Yeah.
And I think I apply the same logic as when if I got friends together and I said, let's create a world like Lord of the Rings. No one would care. And then I say, okay, well let's actually split that up so that each one of us gets to create the story of one character within that world. No one would care. But then the moment you say D&D, and I think it's a little crazy. And part of it, like I said, part of it is valid.
Yeah.
And that there have been people, who, being weak-minded, they get drawn away by it, or they go and they do all these things. But I think the same can be said for anything. You say that if you play with a Nerf gun, eventually that's going to make you a killer. I don't think that's true.
Yeah, it's one of those things where everything that we have in this world can potentially be a stumbling block, right? And I think that Dungeons and Dragons comes with its own special issues, but I loved your story about bringing a Christian into your group, and it is, there is something kind of cool about friends being able to spend time doing this thing. So, if you want to listen to more, check out our podcast tomorrow. It drops tomorrow, Thursday. Really, really excited about hearing it because I wasn't a part of the podcast, so I'm excited to hear it. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you so much.